We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel. The call began at 10:41 p.m. on February 12, 1986, during one of the worst blizzards to hit Windsor County in a decade. The storm had moved in from Canada that afternoon, swallowing Route 131 under white sheets of wind and snow. In the small town of Hartville, population 2,302, most residents were already asleep when the phone at the corner of Main and Depot crackled to life. It was one of the last functioning payphones in town, bolted beside an old general store that had closed 2 years earlier. A single streetlight flickered above the booth, its orange bulb fighting the storm's chaos. Inside, 19-year-old Lily Weaver pressed the receiver to her ear with shaking hands, her breath fogging the glass as she dialed her sister's number from memory. Across the state in Burlington, 24-year-old Jenna Weaver was washing dishes when the call came through. She would later tell police that her sister's voice was trembling, not from the cold but from something else, something she couldn't explain. "Jen, I need you to listen. I think someone's following me." Those were the first words recorded in Jenna's handwritten statement. She described hearing howling wind and engine idling and then the faint hum of static. Lily's voice faded in and out, as if the storm itself were trying to swallow her words. "Where are you?" Jenna asked, drying her hands on a dish towel, her heart beginning to race. "Main Street by the old store. My car wouldn't start. I thought maybe," a pause. Then the clatter of something metal striking the booth. Jenna said her sister gasped, whispered something that sounded like, "He's here," and then the line went dead. The entire call lasted 40 seconds. By the time Jenna reached the Hartville Sheriff's Department by landline, the only way to reach them before 911 was introduced statewide, nearly 30 minutes had passed. Dispatcher notes later showed the call logged at 11:17 p.m. Sheriff Paul Harland, a veteran officer known for his methodical calm, radioed Deputy Roy Lambert to check the area near the general store. It was a 10-minute drive from the station, but with wind gusts over 50 miles per hour and snowdrifts already knee-deep, Lambert didn't arrive until 11:46 p.m. His headlights caught the shape of the payphone booth leaning slightly in the wind, its glass walls frosted over. Lily's car, a faded blue 1979 Honda Civic, sat 20 feet away with its hood up and the driver's side door open. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine cold, and the snow beneath the open door showed only one set of footprints, Lily's, leading from the car to the booth. Deputy Lambert's flashlight beam swept across the scene, a half-full coffee thermos in the passenger seat, a stack of community college textbooks on the floor, and a canvas messenger bag slumped against the gear shift. Inside the booth, the phone dangled by its cord, still humming with a faint dial tone. Lambert called out her name, his voice muffled by the storm. No answer. He circled the car, searching for additional tracks, but the snow was smooth, except for the single line of prints leading in. None leading out. The deputy's report from that night would later describe the eerie silence, the way the storm seemed to pause as he stood between the booth and the car, listening. He thought he heard something faint, a rhythmic tapping like metal against glass, but when he turned toward the noise, there was nothing. Only the hiss of wind and the steady crackle of his radio. Sheriff Harland arrived at 12:22 a.m., the storm worsening by the minute. He and Lambert conducted a perimeter sweep with flashlights, their beams cutting through the snow in short arcs. The search expanded to the alley behind the store and the train tracks that ran parallel to Depot Road. The snow erased everything within minutes. By 1:30 a.m., visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. The search was suspended at 2 a.m., with plans to resume at first light. Before leaving, Harland photographed the scene using a department-issued Polaroid camera, documenting Lily's footprints, the booth, and the open car door. Those photographs, grainy and underexposed, would become the foundation of a case that would haunt the state of Vermont for the next 35 years. When the storm broke at dawn, the search resumed with volunteers from the Hartville Fire Department and local residents. They fanned out across fields and along frozen creeks, shouting Lily's name into the brittle morning air. The only new discovery came from an 8-year-old boy named Caleb Dunn, who found Lily's scarf tangled in a fence near the old rail line half a mile from the booth. It was a wool scarf, red with white stitching, later confirmed by her sister as the one she'd worn that night. The scarf was stiff with ice but bore no blood, no signs of struggle, only a faint scent of Lily's jasmine perfume. As the day wore on, the town of Hartville transformed into a living search grid. Snowmobiles crisscrossed the fields, dogs sniffed the air for traces of human scent, and every barn, culvert, and shed within a 2-mile radius was opened. By sunset, the official report classified the case as missing person, suspicious circumstances. Sheriff Harlan's evening press briefing drew local news crews from as far as Rutland. "We are treating this as an active investigation," he told cameras, his face expressionless. "We have no evidence of foul play at this time, but we have no evidence of voluntary disappearance either." Behind him, Lily's parents stood side by side, holding a framed photo of their daughter taken just 2 weeks earlier at her community college winter formal, smiling, wearing a blue dress, unaware that she would soon become the subject of statewide headlines. By February 14th, the Hartville Disappearance had made front-page news in every Vermont paper. The story resonated not just because of Lily's youth, but because of the haunting image it left behind: a snow-covered street, a phone still humming, and a girl's footprints that stopped cold. Reporters speculated wildly: abduction, runaway, even supernatural theories fueled by the vanishing tracks. State police were called in, forensic teams examined the area, and divers searched the frozen Black River in case Lily had somehow wandered toward the water. Nothing. The case had no body, no witnesses, no suspects. Only that 40-second phone call that Jenna Weaver replayed endlessly in her mind, remembering the sound that came right before the line went dead. A soft, low hum beneath her sister's voice, like someone breathing too close to the receiver. By the end of that first week, Hartville changed in ways that would never fully reverse. People started locking their doors. Parents stopped letting teenagers walk home alone after dark. The booth was removed by the county in early March, officially due to vandalism, though residents whispered it was because no one could bear to see it anymore. The spot where it once stood became an unspoken memorial, marked only by a bare patch of pavement that the snow never seemed to settle on quite the same way again. But the truth about what happened to Lily Weaver would not remain buried forever. Decades later, long after the storm had passed and the town had tried to forget, a box of forgotten evidence in a state archive would reopen the case, revealing that the sound Jenna heard on the line that night wasn't static at all. When the blizzard lifted over Hartville on February 13, 1986, the morning light revealed a town suspended between disbelief and dread. Snow blanketed every inch of Main Street, erasing all evidence of human presence except the faint impressions around the payphone. Reporters gathered outside the sheriff's department, their breath visible in the cold as they waited for updates. Inside, Sheriff Paul Harlan sat hunched over his desk, a cup of coffee cooling beside the incident log. He'd barely slept. The case file already contained 2 photographs, a statement from Jenna Weaver, and the single Polaroid of Lily's footprints ending abruptly in the snow. Harlan had been on the force for 27 years. He'd seen suicides, drownings, domestic disputes gone lethal, but never something like this. Never a disappearance that defied physics. He replayed Jenna's words over and over. She said someone was following her. She said, "He's here." He wanted to dismiss it as panic, hysteria, or a bad connection, but every time he looked at the photo of the empty snowfield, that option seemed to vanish. Deputy Roy Lambert entered the office carrying a paper bag from the general store. "Coffee and muffins," he said quietly. "Search teams are ready." Harlan nodded without looking up. "Expand the perimeter west toward the rail line," he instructed. "And get the dogs out again. If she's out there, we'll find her before nightfall." Lambert hesitated. "Sir, it's been 12 hours. She's 19, unarmed, no coat heavy enough for that weather. You think she's still alive?" Harlan didn't answer. He just took the coffee and stared at the frost crawling across the window. By mid-afternoon, the Vermont State Police had arrived with portable heat sensors and tracking dogs brought in from Montpelier. They mapped the area around the phone booth in a meticulous grid, marking points of interest with orange flags. Each step, each anomaly was documented. Investigators found 2 cigarette butts near the booth, Marlboro Reds, crushed into the snow, and a partial boot print that didn't match Lily's. The tread pattern, later identified as belonging to a men's work boot, size 10, ran parallel to Lily's smaller tracks but stopped several feet before the booth. There were no signs of struggle, no drag marks, no evidence that anyone had fallen or been carried. It was as if the second set of tracks had been deliberately erased. Forensic teams collected samples from Lily's car. The passenger seat bore faint traces of a greasy residue, possibly from gloves. The steering wheel and gear shift were wiped clean, but one partial fingerprint was lifted from the inside of the driver's door handle. In 1986, DNA analysis didn't exist beyond rudimentary blood typing, and even fingerprint databases were limited to local jurisdiction. The print was logged as unmatched, stored in a cardboard evidence box that would gather dust for decades. That night, Sheriff Harland visited the Weaver family home in North Hartville. Lily's parents, Ruth and Walter, sat in their living room surrounded by neighbors who'd come to offer support. The air smelled of coffee and melting snow. Ruth's hands shook as she clutched a blanket to her chest. She called Jenna, she kept repeating. She called for help, and no one got there in time. Walter sat beside her, silent, eyes fixed on the television, though it wasn't turned on. Harland promised them he would not stop searching. He meant it, but part of him already sensed the outcome. Missing person cases had a rhythm. The first 12 hours were hope, the next 12 were realism, and everything after that was recovery. But nothing about Lily's case fit that rhythm. By February 16th, the official search had expanded across 8 square miles. Helicopters scanned the snow-covered forest using thermal imaging, and divers cut through the ice along the Black River. No trace of Lily, no coat, no boots, no body. The only new evidence came from a nearby truck driver who reported seeing a figure on the shoulder of Route 131 around 11 p.m. on the night of the storm. Could have been a woman, he said. Hard to tell. I slowed down, but then the figure just disappeared. The man's testimony was vague and unreliable, but it was enough to reignite speculation that Lily had been abducted. The case attracted the attention of a Burlington newspaper reporter named Thomas "Tommy" Crane, a 32-year-old journalist with a reputation for chasing unsolved mysteries. Crane arrived in Hartville on February 18th and immediately began interviewing locals. His first article, published under the headline, "The Girl Who Vanished from the Snow," framed the story as both tragedy and folklore. In the quiet town of Hartville, he wrote, a 19-year-old vanished into thin air during a storm so fierce it erased her from the earth. Her last words, "He's here," still echo through the wind. The piece caught statewide attention and national interest, turning Hartville into a pilgrimage site for amateur sleuths and paranormal enthusiasts. Harland despised Crane's coverage, but he couldn't deny that publicity brought leads, though most of them turned out to be useless. Weeks became months. Spring melted the snow, revealing the skeletal remains of winter, broken branches, discarded beer cans, and animal tracks, but no sign of Lily. Her disappearance joined a growing list of Vermont cold cases. On paper, it was just another missing person file, tagged with an unsolved notation and moved to the archives. But to those who'd been there that night, the case never left their minds. Deputy Lambert left the department in 1988, citing personal reasons, though co-workers whispered that he'd started drinking heavily and refused to drive past the old store after dark. Sheriff Harland retired in 1991. He kept Lily's Polaroid in his wallet until the day he died. For Jenna Weaver, the years after her sister's disappearance were a blur of grief, anger, and guilt. She left Vermont for Maine, got married, divorced, and tried to rebuild a life away from the echoes of that night. But every February she would dream of the sound, the muffled breath on the other end of the line, and wake up convinced that Lily was still trying to speak to her. In 2006, on the 20th anniversary of the disappearance, Jenna returned to Hartville for the first time. The town had changed little. The payphone booth was gone, replaced by a small patch of gravel and a municipal trash can. Someone had placed a bouquet of frozen lilies there, their petals brittle in the cold. A handwritten note taped to the pole read, "Never forgotten." It was that anniversary visit that brought the case back to life. While visiting the sheriff's department to speak with a local historian, Jenna overheard 2 deputies discussing a state initiative to digitize old evidence tapes. She asked if her sister's case had any audio on record. The deputy shrugged. "Maybe," he said. Back then, dispatch sometimes recorded incoming calls. "We're cataloging them now." Jenna left her contact information and thought nothing more of it. But 6 months later, a manila envelope arrived at her apartment in Portland, Maine. Inside was a CD marked Hartville Missing, Row 2, 1286, audio copy. Jenna didn't play it immediately. She waited 3 days, pacing her apartment until the weight of curiosity became unbearable. When she finally pressed play, what she heard made her knees buckle. The first 20 seconds matched her memory exactly. Lily's frightened voice, the wind, the panic. But then came something new. Beneath the static was another sound, faint but distinct. A man's voice, low and calm, saying something that the tape barely captured. She replayed it a dozen times before making out the words. "It's okay, I'll take you home." The tone wasn't angry. It was almost gentle. That single phrase changed everything. Lily hadn't been alone in that booth. Jenna contacted Vermont State Police immediately, and within weeks the case was officially reopened. Detective Samuel Graves, a 40-year-old investigator known for cold case work, was assigned to lead the review. Graves was methodical, cautious, and deeply skeptical of folklore. He approached the case like an engineer solving a mechanical problem. First, he authenticated the audio tape. It had indeed been recorded automatically by the old dispatch system, preserved by accident in a mislabeled box. The voice on the recording was clear enough for forensic audio specialists to extract a usable sample. Using spectral analysis, they confirmed that the male voice was not the same as the deputy who responded that night or anyone else interviewed in 1986. The discovery reignited public interest. Newspapers revisited the case and television crews returned to Hartville to film anniversary segments. For the first time in decades, tips began flowing in. One in particular stood out, a retired lineman named Everett E.J. Halperin, who had been working for the phone company that winter, claimed that the payphone had been scheduled for maintenance on February 10, 2 days before Lily's disappearance, but the work order had been canceled by a man using the name R. Calloway. The company had no record of any employee by that name. Halperin remembered it because he'd received the call himself. Sounded like an older guy, he told detectives. Said he'd handle it personally. Detective Graves traced the canceled work order through decades-old paper archives. The signature at the bottom, though faded, appeared to read Richard Calloway. A background search revealed no such person living in Windsor County in 1986, but the name did appear on an electrical subcontractor list from a defunct maintenance firm that serviced rural Vermont. Further digging revealed that one of the subcontractors listed under that firm had once worked part-time for the Windsor County Maintenance Department. A man named Robert Bob Lorne. Lorne had been 43 in 1986, a Vietnam veteran known locally as a handyman who fixed wiring, pumps, and furnaces. He'd left Hartville in 1989 after a series of complaints about trespassing on private property and inappropriate behavior toward teenage girls. No charges had ever been filed. When Graves tracked him down in 2007, Lorne was living in a trailer outside Barre, Vermont, working sporadically as a janitor for an industrial park. When questioned, he claimed no memory of the Hartville incident and denied knowing Lily Weaver. "You people are always digging up ghosts," he said. "If that girl disappeared, she probably wanted to. Happens all the time." Graves noted inconsistencies immediately. Lorne's employment records showed he had access to county maintenance keys in 1986, including keys to phone booths for equipment checks. Audio specialists compared his 2007 interview to the male voice on the tape. The match probability exceeded 87%. It wasn't enough for a warrant, but it was enough to make Graves certain Bob Lorne had been there that night. The question was what exactly he'd done and where Lily Weaver had gone. 2 months later, an unexpected lead emerged. A road expansion project on Route 131 unearthed a rusted metal object near the tree line, roughly a mile from where Lily's car had been found. Workers initially thought it was scrap, but when they pulled it free, they realized it was a payphone handset. Cracked, half-buried, its cord still attached. Forensic testing revealed traces of blood in the receiver's earpiece, degraded but still testable. In 2007, DNA testing technology had advanced enough to extract partial profiles from even ancient samples. The lab report returned 2 months later. The blood matched the Weaver family's mitochondrial DNA line. It was Lily's. For the first time in 21 years, investigators had proof that Lily hadn't walked away voluntarily. She'd bled, at least briefly, inside that booth. Combined with the male voice on the tape, the evidence pointed to assault and abduction. Detective Graves confronted Bob Lorne again, this time with a state attorney present. Lorne's demeanor changed from irritated to defensive. "You think I killed that girl?" he said, his hands trembling. I fixed a damn phone, that's all. They told me to check it, I did. I never saw no girl. When Graves played him the restored audio, Lorne's reaction was immediate. His breathing quickened. That's not me, he insisted. You can't prove it. Graves leaned forward. Maybe not yet, he said quietly. But we will. The investigation would stretch into 2008, unearthing new evidence buried under decades of neglect and snow. What the detectives discovered next, hidden in an old police storage vault, would finally explain what happened during those 40 seconds on February 12, 1986, and why the sound Jenna heard was only the beginning of something much darker. Detective Samuel Graves had been working cold cases for nearly 15 years, but none had wrapped itself around his mind the way the Weaver disappearance did. He would wake in the middle of the night thinking about the 40 seconds, about the way the words he's here seemed to hang between panic and resignation. He'd replay the audio recording until the hiss of the analog tape felt like breathing in his ear. It wasn't just the mystery that haunted him, it was the absence of everything else. No body, no witnesses, no confession, just the lingering trace of a voice that sounded almost tender when it said, "I'll take you home." By late spring of 2008, the investigation had stalled again. The blood on the phone receiver proved that Lily had been injured, but not fatally. The DNA was too degraded to reveal much more. The audio match to Bob Lorne wasn't strong enough for a conviction, and the state's attorney refused to pursue charges based on what he called ghost evidence. Graves spent his evenings combing through old records from the now-defunct Windsor County Maintenance Department, hoping for something, anything, that might connect Lorne more directly to that night. What he found instead was a mess of yellowed invoices, repair slips, and time cards stored in a damp basement beneath the old courthouse. The boxes smelled of mildew and dust, their labels faded to illegibility. Graves worked alone, methodically sorting each file under the flickering light of a single bulb. It was there, buried under a stack of unrelated electrical schematics, that he found a folder stamped Telecom Field Service Reports, 1985-1986. The paperwork listed routine maintenance visits for payphones across Windsor County, including the one at Main and Depot in Hartville. The report, dated February 10th, 2 days before Lily's disappearance, was signed by R. Calloway, the same alias traced earlier. But beneath that, in faint pencil, was another notation that chilled Graves. Equipment test scheduled, recording function installed. He froze, staring at the words, recording function. In 1986, few rural payphones had any kind of recording capacity. The systems were analog, connected to central exchanges that tracked usage but not audio. Yet here was documentation suggesting that the Hartville phone had been modified to capture calls, perhaps as part of an equipment test or surveillance program. Graves flipped the page and found an attached form marked Confidential, Vermont Communications Cooperative. The cooperative had contracted local technicians for a pilot project testing rural call monitoring, ostensibly for quality assurance. But one of the authorized contractors listed was Lorne R. His name appeared on 3 separate work orders between December 1985 and February 1986. The implications hit Graves like a physical blow. Lorne hadn't just been near that phone, he'd installed hardware inside it. The same man suspected of being at the scene had also wired the booth to record voices. If he'd tampered with the equipment, he could have erased or altered recordings after the fact, or used them to monitor calls made from the location. The detective's pulse quickened. For the first time, the impossible case had a tangible technical explanation. The next step was to find out whether any of those recordings still existed. Most telephone companies in the 1980s archived such test data on magnetic reels stored in climate-controlled facilities. Graves reached out to the remnants of the Vermont Communications Cooperative, now absorbed by a larger telecommunications conglomerate. After weeks of bureaucratic delays, he was granted access to a storage facility in White River Junction where hundreds of reel-to-reel tapes sat stacked in gray boxes labeled only by date ranges. On June 2, 2008, Graves and an evidence technician named Laura Keating spent 9 hours sifting through boxes until they found a reel marked Test Batch VT021286. The date matched the night of Lily's call. The tape was brittle with age, its label peeling, but the technician carefully loaded it onto a restored playback deck. The faint click of the spools filled the small archive room as the tape began to spin. For a moment there was only static, the familiar rush of white noise. And then Lily's voice emerged, thin and terrified. "Jen, I need you to listen. I think someone's following me." Graves leaned forward, heart pounding. The audio quality was far clearer than the dispatch copy Jenna had received. Every breath, every crack of wind sounded close enough to touch. Lily's voice trembled as she described the headlights behind her, how her car had stalled, how she'd run to the phone. Then came the sound. The male voice, unmistakable, soft and deliberate. "It's okay. I'll take you home." But on this recording, something else followed. A shuffle of movement, a muffled struggle, a sharp metallic clang, then silence. A full 10 seconds of nothing before the line clicked dead. The technician looked at Graves, eyes wide. "That wasn't on the dispatch copy," she whispered. Graves nodded slowly. "No, it was erased. Someone had edited the original tape before turning it over to authorities. The discovery meant that the initial investigation had been sabotaged, and the only person with access to the phone hardware and the recording system in 1986 was Robert Lorne. When confronted with the new evidence, Lorne laughed. It wasn't the laugh of innocence, but of a man cornered by ghosts he thought were long buried. "You think you can prove anything with your little tape?" he sneered across the interrogation table. "You can't even prove she's dead." Graves said nothing, just pressed play on a portable recorder. The voice filled the room again. Lily's, pleading, the man's calm reply, then that hollow clang. Lorne's smile faltered. His fingers twitched on the table. "That's not me," he said finally, but the conviction was gone. The state attorney approved a search warrant for Lorne's property the following morning. The trailer outside Bari was a collapsing structure surrounded by junked cars and rusting appliances. Inside, the smell of motor oil and mildew hung thick. Investigators found stacks of old maintenance manuals, boxes of phone components, and dozens of photographs clipped to a string above the workbench. Most showed telephone booths, rural, isolated, some in Vermont, others across New Hampshire and Maine. In several, a woman could be seen reflected faintly in the glass, often unaware she was being photographed. None of them were Lily, but the pattern was clear. Lorne had been documenting his work, or his obsession. The most damning discovery came from a sealed metal toolbox hidden beneath the trailer's floorboards. Inside were personal items, jewelry, scarves, small notebooks, and a driver's license issued to L. Weaver. The license had expired in 1987, 1 year after Lily vanished. Graves lifted it with gloved hands, staring at the smiling face of a girl frozen in time. "Jesus," one of the officers murmured. The box was photographed and catalogued, its contents bagged for evidence, but even with this discovery there was still no body, no definitive proof of death. In August 2008, investigators began excavating the wooded area behind Lorne's property. Ground-penetrating radar indicated several disturbances in the soil. The first two turned out to be animal burrows. The third, located near an old generator shed, revealed something else: a shallow grave lined with pieces of rusted metal and telephone wire. Inside, forensic teams recovered partial skeletal remains wrapped in a decayed tarp. Dental records confirmed the impossible. After 22 years, the remains of Lily Weaver had been found. News of the discovery spread through Vermont within hours. The headline the next morning read, "Hartville girl found after 22 years. Suspect in custody." Hartville's residents gathered outside the old general store, some in silence, some in tears. Jenna flew in from Maine to identify her sister's due possessions, a silver ring and a locket containing a faded photo of the two of them as children. The sheriff's department held a press conference under the same flickering streetlight where Lily had made her final call. "This is the closure we've waited for," Detective Graves said. "But closure isn't peace." Lorne's trial began in April 2009. The prosecution presented the recovered audio, the photographs, the jewelry box, and forensic evidence linking soil from Lorne's property to trace particles found in Lily's boots. Experts testified about his access to phone equipment, his history of voyeurism, and the deliberate erasure of the original tape. The defense argued mental instability, claiming Lorne suffered from chronic delusions and had confessed to multiple crimes he never committed. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder and obstruction of justice. Lorne was sentenced to life without parole. For the first time since 1986, the Weaver family could visit a grave that bore Lily's name. The service was small, quiet, attended by townspeople who still remembered the blizzard, the payphone, the mystery that had hung over their lives. Jenna spoke briefly, her voice steady. She wasn't a legend, she said. She was a person, and now she's home. After the sentencing, Detective Graves requested one final access to Lorne's confiscated property. He wanted to examine the reel-to-reel tapes found in the trailer, 15 in total, labeled with dates and locations. Each contained audio from different payphones across New England, all recorded between 1984 and 1986. Most were ordinary conversations, fragments of strangers' lives, lovers arguing, weather reports, calls for taxis. But one tape, marked only with the word test, held something different. It began with static, then a woman's voice, unidentified, asking for change for $1. A man's voice responded, "I can help you. Step inside where it's warm." The rest was silence, broken only by the sound of breathing and the faint hum of electricity. Graves stopped the tape midway, staring at the spinning reels. How many others had there been? How many voices erased by storms, by time, by a man who'd learned how to make people disappear through the thin glass of a phone booth? That question would never be answered. Lorne died in prison in 2012, found slumped in his cell beside a transistor radio tuned to static. His death was ruled a heart attack. When guards cleaned his belongings, they found a note taped beneath his bunk. "I told her I'd take her home." Hartville never replaced the phone booth. The corner of Main and Depot remains empty, a patch of cracked pavement where snow drifts gather in strange, swirling patterns each winter. Locals say that on stormy nights, if you stand there long enough, you can still hear the faint ring of a payphone buried under the wind, waiting for someone to answer. Detective Samuel Graves didn't sleep for nearly 3 days after the trial ended. He sat in his office surrounded by boxes of evidence, old payphone schematics, photographs, and the 15 reel-to-reel tapes found inside Robert Lorne's trailer. The official narrative said the case was over. Lorne was dead, justice had been served, the missing girl from Hartville was finally at rest. But Graves couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The details didn't fit neatly into the pattern of a single killing born of opportunity. Lorne hadn't just stumbled across Lily Weaver on that snowbound night. He had been prepared. He had installed equipment, manipulated the phone system, and recorded conversations from multiple towns. What he'd done wasn't random, it was systemic. The problem was that no one wanted to hear that. The state attorney's office had already filed its final paperwork. The local press had moved on to other stories, and the people of Hartville wanted to forget. But Graves was the kind of investigator who couldn't let silence stand in for truth. He believed that patterns told stories, even when the living refused to listen. He began cataloging every tape recovered from Lorne's trailer. The recordings were labeled only by month and year, sometimes by vague location codes like NH021, VT112, or ME04. Graves listened to them late at night in the department's evidence lab, jotting notes on a legal pad under the dim fluorescent light. The first few were uneventful, snippets of weather reports, wrong numbers, people calling home from long-distance routes. But the further he went, the darker the recordings became. On one tape from March 1985, Graves heard a female voice that stopped his pen mid-sentence. The woman sounded young, maybe college-aged, calling from a roadside booth near Rutland, Vermont. "Mom, I'm on my way home," she said. "The snow's picking up again, There was a pause, then a faint male voice in the background. "Need a hand with that car?" The girl's breathing changed, quickened, and then the call cut off with a click. The police had no record of any missing person reported that night, but something about the tone, the sudden silence, was unmistakable. Another tape, dated September 1984 and marked NH03, contained a similar interaction, a woman's voice asking for directions, followed by the same male baritone saying, "It's okay. I'll take you home." Graves replayed it dozens of times, his skin crawling. The words were identical to the phrase spoken to Lily Weaver. Not just similar, identical, down to the cadence, the breath between syllables. Lorne had repeated the same line for years, like a ritual. Graves expanded his search into regional archives, cross-referencing disappearances from 1983 to 1987. The list that emerged was chilling. 6 women across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine had vanished during that time frame, each last seen near a rest stop, gas station, or roadside payphone. All were under 30, all traveling alone, all reported missing in winter months. At the time, the disappearances had been treated as isolated incidents, attributed to weather or voluntary runaways. But Graves knew better now. He compiled the evidence into a report he called The Cold Line, a 112-page document detailing how the phone booths themselves might have served as both hunting ground and archive. He theorized that Lorne's work for the Vermont Communications Cooperative gave him access to hundreds of booths across the region. He could move freely under the guise of maintenance, collecting personal information from calls and observing who used the phones at night. Each booth was isolated, often miles from the nearest patrol route. In those moments of vulnerability, when a person thought they were reaching out for help, Lorne was the one listening. Graves submitted the Cold Line to the Vermont State Police in early 2010. The report was quietly shelved. The department, weary of reopening old wounds, refused to authorize new investigations without fresh forensic evidence. Graves was told to let the dead rest, so he kept digging on his own time. He reached out to journalists, hoping someone might care enough to publicize the pattern. Most declined, too old, too cold, too speculative. But one reporter did respond. Her name was Eleanor Pike, an independent documentarian who specialized in rural disappearances. She had read about the Hartville case years earlier and had always felt there was more beneath the surface. When Graves contacted her in the spring of 2011, she agreed to meet at a diner in Montpelier. She arrived with a battered notebook and a camera bag slung over her shoulder. Graves brought photocopies of his report and 2 of the tapes. They spent 6 hours at that diner, the kind of conversation that reshapes both people involved. Pike listened to the recordings with headphones, her brow furrowing deeper with every minute. "It's not just murder," she said finally. "It's surveillance." He was documenting them, recording their fear. This wasn't about power, it was about preservation. Graves nodded. He wanted proof. Proof that he could reach into someone's life and take it away. Over the next 6 months, Pike worked with Graves to produce a limited podcast series called Echoes on the Line. Each episode chronicled one of the disappearances Graves had linked to Lorne's movements. The production was minimalist, just voice, static, and the original tape clips layered beneath narration. The series aired in early 2012, and within a week it had become a cult phenomenon among true crime enthusiasts. Callers flooded Pike's inbox with theories, possible connections, even new information. One message stood out. It came from a retired switchboard technician named Caroline Myers, who had worked for the same communications cooperative in the mid-1980s. She claimed she remembered Robert Lorne, not as a full-time employee, but as a subcontractor hired for a special internal project called Echo Pilot. He was quiet, always watching, she wrote. They told us we were testing signal clarity, but he said he was testing people. When Graves and Pike met her in person, Myers produced an old personnel badge stamped with the Echo Pilot logo, a phone handset inside a triangle, and a folder containing handwritten notes about the project. The notes described a series of field installations meant to test voice clarity under adverse conditions. In plain language, that meant phone booths placed intentionally in isolated, high-noise environments, mountain passes, rural roads, or blizzard-prone areas. Technicians were instructed to record live calls for quality analysis, then erase them after testing. But Lorne, according to Myers, had insisted on keeping his own copies for calibration. No one had questioned it. What chilled Graves most was a list of test sites. Hartville was on it. So were 5 other towns corresponding to the missing women. Pike's documentary reached its final episode in June 2012, the same week Lorne died in prison. The timing fueled public fascination, though neither Pike nor Graves believed in coincidence. When the prison inventory of Lorne's possessions was released, one item caught Graves' attention, a small metal pendant shaped like a phone dial found on a chain around his neck. Engraved on the back were 3 words, "Still connected, always." Pike wanted to end the story there, with a chilling final image and the implication that justice had prevailed. But Graves couldn't stop. He kept researching long after the microphones were packed away. He submitted DNA samples from the recovered jewelry box to cross-state databases, hoping to identify other victims. 2 months later, a lab in New Hampshire called. One of the hair strands didn't belong to Lily Weaver. It matched an unsolved 1985 case from Grafton County. The victim, 22-year-old Rachel Marin, had disappeared from a gas station along Route 4. Her body was never found. Until now. The confirmation reignited the case, forcing the state to reopen the cold line file officially. Graves was vindicated, but the victory felt hollow. Every piece of evidence unearthed only revealed how much had been missed the first time. Dozens of reports from the mid-1980s described women who vanished near payphones, but the cases were scattered across jurisdictions that rarely communicated. Lorne had exploited that fragmentation. He didn't have to be clever. He just had to wait for the system to fail. In late 2013, Pike and Graves met one last time. They stood together at the edge of the field where the Hartville payphone had once stood, now just a concrete square half buried in grass. The air was cold, the sky colorless. Pike recorded ambient sound for her documentary's epilogue: wind, distant traffic, the faint buzz of power lines. Graves said quietly, "Every time someone made a call out here, they thought they were reaching someone they trusted. They didn't know they were talking to him first." Pike looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Do you think there are more tapes?" she asked. Graves hesitated. "I think he kept recording until the day he was arrested. I think some of them are still out there." He was right. In 2015, a construction crew demolishing an old service station in southern Vermont uncovered a sealed metal locker embedded in the foundation. Inside were several cassette reels wrapped in plastic and labeled with dates ranging from 1987 to 1989, years after Lorne's supposed final known activity. Audio forensics later confirmed the recordings were made using the same modified hardware signature as the earlier tapes. But one of the voices was different. It wasn't Lorne's. The unidentified man spoke in short, deliberate sentences, using the same words Lorne had used decades earlier. "It's okay. I'll take you home." The implication was inescapable. Lorne hadn't worked alone, or someone had learned from him. The revelation sent shockwaves through Vermont law enforcement and reopened speculation that Echo Pilot had been larger than anyone realized. Graves retired the following year, worn out and haunted by the knowledge that the signal might still be transmitting somewhere, that another line might still be open. Pike's documentary won awards and later inspired a streaming adaptation, but she refused all interviews afterward. She told friends she sometimes heard static on her home phone at night, even though she'd switched to digital service years before. Today, the corner of Main and Depot remains unmarked, though locals still leave flowers there every February. On certain nights when the snow falls heavy and the wind comes from the north, drivers claim to see the faint glow of a phone booth where none exists. A rectangle of light flickering for a few seconds before fading back into darkness. Some say it's just the reflection of headlights on the snow. Others whisper that it's something else, a line that was never truly disconnected. When the locker of post-1989 tapes surfaced, the state forensic lab expected decay, water damage, corrosion, magnetic loss. Instead, the reels were pristine, sealed in paraffin wax as though preserved intentionally. The dates on the plastic sleeves, January 1987 through November 1989, made no sense. By then, the Vermont Communications Cooperative had long dismantled its field recording program, and Robert Lorne had already been fired from every contract he'd ever held. Yet the voices on those tapes carried the same tone, the same distorted hiss of analog circuitry that marked Lorne's earlier work. Someone had kept his system alive. Detective Samuel Graves came out of retirement to consult unofficially. He told reporters he owed the dead the rest of the story. He didn't wear a badge anymore. He worked from his kitchen table, using an old tape deck and a pair of cracked headphones. The first reel he played, labeled Oro 1-1287 VT Ridgeway, opened with heavy static, followed by the faint hum of a fluorescent bulb. Then came a young woman's voice. "It's so cold, can you hear me? Hello?" Her tone was frightened but polite, the way people spoke before they realized they were in danger. Then a man's voice answered, low and calm. "It's okay, I'll take you home." Graves stopped the tape. He had heard those exact words 100 times before, always from the same mouth. But this voice wasn't Lorne's. The timbre was higher, the cadence slightly uncertain, like someone performing a line from memory. The imitation was deliberate. Someone was copying him. The Vermont Bureau of Investigation formed a temporary task force to analyze the recordings. The team included forensic audio specialists, linguists, and retired telecom engineers. They determined that the hardware used matched Lorne's modification designs down to the resistor model and microphone placement. Whoever made the new recordings had access to his blueprints, or to the original booths. But almost all the old booths had been removed in the early 90s. Only a handful remained in forgotten corners of rural New England. Graves and an agent named Evelyn Hart, a younger investigator who had grown up hearing the Weaver case whispered about at school, began tracing the surviving booths using old service maps. One was in Groveton, New Hampshire, another in Bennington, Vermont, and a third near Rangeley, Maine. When they inspected the booth in Bennington, Hart noticed a hairline seam in the metal casing behind the coin return. Inside was a hidden audio recorder powered by a car battery and a modified cassette deck. The design was identical to Lorne's. The tape inside was new. The recording captured traffic sounds, distant wind, and a voice. A man's. "You shouldn't be out here alone," it said. A woman replied, startled. "I'm fine, thanks." Then static. Nothing else. The timestamp printed on the tape's edge was September 2003. Lorne had been in prison that year. Someone else had taken his place. Hart and Graves cross-referenced missing persons reports from the early 2000s and found one that fit. Kelly Forner, 27, disappeared September 9, 2003, after her car broke down on Route 9 near Bennington. She had stopped to call roadside assistance from a payphone. The car was later found locked, engine cold, no signs of struggle. Locals remembered the case but never connected it to the Weaver disappearance. It was nearly 2 decades later. The evidence reopened the possibility that Lorne hadn't been acting alone even in the 1980s. Graves requested access to the original Echo Pilot employee rosters again. Among the subcontractors listed beneath Lorne's name in 1985 was one entry that had always seemed trivial. Assistant Tech, C. Halperin. The surname jumped out immediately. Everett E.J. Halperin, the retired lineman who had first told investigators about the canceled maintenance order in Hartville back in 2007. At the time, Halperin had seemed harmless, a soft-spoken man in his 70s, chain-smoking through interviews, offering vague recollections of that winter. But when Graves looked deeper, he discovered that Halperin had not retired until 1990, 4 years after Lorne's arrest, and had continued working maintenance on decommissioned booths under a private contract. His home address placed him within 20 miles of both the Bennington and Ridgeway sites. Hart and Graves drove out to Halperin's property in October 2015. It was a narrow farmhouse on the edge of a frozen marsh, surrounded by rusted trucks and coiled cable spools. Halperin answered the door in a wool vest, his hair white and uncombed. He recognized Graves instantly. "You're the one who put Bob in the ground," he said, smiling without warmth. They questioned him for nearly an hour. He claimed ignorance, insisting he'd kept spare parts from old jobs but nothing else. When Hart mentioned the Bennington recording, something flickered behind his eyes. He said softly, "Bob always said the line had to stay open. People forget, but signals remember." Hart froze. "What do you mean, stay open?" Halperin shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Static's just ghosts trying to talk back." They left with no warrant and no admission, but both knew he was lying. Graves called the Bureau that night and requested surveillance authorization. Within a week, Halperin's phone line was under tap, ironically poetic given the history. At 2:14 a.m. on November 3rd, analysts recorded an outgoing call from Halperin's landline to an unlisted Vermont number. The call lasted 43 seconds. When investigators played the intercept, their blood ran cold. The first sound was the faint hum of a payphone line, then Halperin's voice. "I've kept it clear. The line's yours now." A pause. Then another man's voice answered, young, measured, emotionless. "I'll take it from here." The number traced to a disconnected service trunk belonging to the old cooperative, the same network that had powered Echo Pilot. Someone had reactivated it. A raid on Halperin's property followed 2 days later. In a locked shed behind the house, agents found a modern workstation built from scrap electronics, digital mixers, amplifiers, hard drives, and rows of cassette tapes labeled with years extending to 2015. Many were blank. Others contained fragments, traffic noise, snatches of voices, occasional laughter. On one tape, a woman said, "I don't feel safe out here." A male voice replied, faint but clear, "It's okay, I'll take you home." Halperin was arrested without resistance. In interrogation, he confessed partially, speaking in riddles about continuing Bob's work, keeping the voices clean, and testing the silence. He claimed he never harmed anyone directly, only maintained the booths so they could still listen. When asked who they were, he smiled. "Whoever picks up," he said. Further forensic analysis uncovered digital logs showing Halperin had accessed telecom infrastructure using legacy credentials belonging to the defunct cooperative. He had been routing active phone calls, mostly from remote payphones and maintenance lines, through hidden servers that recorded them before transmission. Essentially, he'd built a ghost network, siphoning audio from forgotten infrastructure. But the most disturbing find was not technological. Beneath Halperin's bed, officers found a sealed envelope addressed to Detective S. Graves. Inside was a single photograph of the Hartville payphone, freshly printed, the image taken sometime after the booth had been removed decades earlier. In the reflection of the glass, a blurred silhouette stood holding a recorder. On the back, written in shaky handwriting, "The signal never ends. You just stopped listening." Graves stared at the photo for hours. He began to suspect that Lorne's crimes had birthed something larger than obsession, a culture of watchers, drawn by the mythology of that snowbound night. Echo Pilot might have started as a technical experiment, but for men like Lorne and Halperin, it had become a creed. The Bureau traced the second voice from the tapped call, but found nothing. The number led to an unregistered server that automatically purged itself after each connection. Cyber forensic specialists speculated that Halperin's accomplice had modernized Lorne's analog system into a digital version, a dark switch network that monitored abandoned lines and relay boxes. The pattern extended far beyond Vermont. Similar unexplained recordings began surfacing in Maine, New York, and even Pennsylvania. Static-laced messages uploaded anonymously to online forums, each containing the same whispered phrase, "It's okay, I'll take you home." By 2016, the FBI quietly absorbed the case under its cybercrimes division. Graves was officially retired again, but agents kept consulting him for context. He told them to look for the sound, not the signal, to analyze the breathing, the pauses, the human fingerprint beneath the static. He believed whoever inherited Lorne's work wasn't driven by nostalgia or violence alone, but by the need to keep the myth alive, to remind the world that fear could travel through wires. In January 2017, a final piece of the puzzle surfaced. A telecom historian restoring vintage payphones in Massachusetts purchased a unit from a scrapyard labeled Hartville Depot. Inside its base, taped beneath the wiring panel, was a microcassette dated 02-12-16, exactly 30 years after Lily's disappearance. The audio lasted 40 seconds. The recording began with wind, then the unmistakable hum of a coin dropping. A woman's voice said, "Hello, Jenna?" "It's me." Then static swallowed everything. Laboratory tests confirmed the tape was genuine, not fabricated. The voice matched historical samples of Lily Weaver within a 92% probability. Experts debated whether it was a synthetic recreation, an echo from an old recording, or an elaborate hoax. Graves never accepted any of those explanations. "There are things technology can mimic," he told Agent Hart, "but not fear. You can hear real fear." He spent his final years compiling his own book manuscript, part memoir, part investigation, titled The Signal Remains. It was never published. After Graves's death in 2019, his notes were sealed in the Vermont State Archives. Inside one of the folders, archivists later found a handwritten post-it attached to a copied waveform printout. It read simply, "The line's still live. Don't answer." Today, decades after the blizzard of 1986, the myth of the last phone booth call persists across the internet. Audio enthusiasts claim that if you tune an AM radio to 1600 kHz during a storm in Windsor County, you can hear fragments of Lily's final words drifting through the static, 40 seconds of pleading that loop endlessly before cutting off with a click. Some insist it's coincidence, electromagnetic interference bouncing off old copper lines. Others say it's proof that not every call ends when you hang up. The Hartville Memorial stands a few feet from where the booth once was, a small bronze plaque etched with Lily's name and the dates of her birth and death. Beneath it, someone has scratched a sentence that no one has ever claimed responsibility for engraving. The call was answered. By the winter of 2020, most people had stopped believing in the phone booth story. To younger generations, it was an urban legend, an internet creepypasta that mixed just enough truth to make disbelief uncomfortable. True crime podcasts retold it with haunted music and whispered speculation. But few remembered that the case had once been real, that a woman named Lily Weaver had vanished during a blizzard, that detectives had spent half their lives chasing a signal that refused to die. Detective Samuel Graves had been dead for nearly a year when the call came in to the Vermont Bureau of Investigation. A construction crew clearing land for a solar farm outside Graveton, 30 miles south of Hartville, had unearthed a reinforced concrete vault. It wasn't on any zoning maps, and the entrance had been sealed with industrial epoxy. Inside, workers found a nest of obsolete electronics, tangled copper wire, battery arrays, and racks of cassette recorders linked to a central console that still hummed faintly with residual current. The words Echo Pilot were stenciled in fading black paint above the doorway. Agent Evelyn Hart, now heading the state's cold case division, arrived within the hour. The air inside the vault was dense and metallic, filled with the ghost smell of ozone. The equipment looked more like a museum exhibit than a crime scene, decades of technological evolution crammed into one forgotten tomb. There were at least 30 recorders stacked neatly on metal shelves, each labeled with a date between 1984 and 2019. The final reel bore the inscription 021420 Hartville Disappearance. Forensics swept the room. Radiation levels were normal. The power source, a self-charging thermal unit likely scavenged from industrial machinery. Whoever maintained this bunker had done so meticulously. Dust patterns showed it had been accessed regularly up until the previous year. No fingerprints were recoverable. Every surface was wiped with solvent. But there was one object that seemed deliberately left behind, a leather-bound notebook resting on the console chair. Inside, the handwriting was painfully familiar. Hart recognized it instantly from the archives. It was Samuel Graves's. The first page read, "If you're reading this, I was right. The signal isn't a metaphor. It's a system. Lorne built the network. Halperin kept it alive. But someone else opened it wider than either of them understood. They weren't collecting voices. They were feeding them back." Hart turned the page, her breath fogging in the cold. Graves's notes became erratic, filled with diagrams of transmission loops, annotated spectrograms, and strings of binary code. At the bottom of one page he'd written, almost as an afterthought, "I think the line answers itself now." Technicians powered the console cautiously. The analog meters twitched to life, and one by one, the reels began to spin, slow and deliberate, as if the machines were waking from a long sleep. A speaker crackled on, releasing a wash of static. Then a woman's voice, soft, frightened, unmistakable, filled the bunker. "Jenna, it's me." "I can't see anything. The snow, it's so loud." Hart froze. The voice was Lily's. Not a copy, not an old recording. The metadata encoded on the reel confirmed it had been recorded that morning, February 14th, 2020. For 29 seconds, Lily spoke as though she were still standing in that snowstorm 34 years earlier. She begged for help, for someone to answer, her words fading in and out beneath the sound of wind and an electrical hum that no one could identify. Then another voice joined the transmission, male, calm, familiar. "It's okay," it said. "I'll take you home." The technicians cut power immediately, terrified the reels might erase themselves. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete it seemed to bend the air. The reel was taken to the State Forensic Lab in Montpelier, where analysts confirmed the impossible. The recording was genuine. No signs of splicing or post-production, captured on analog equipment that had not been powered in over a decade. The timestamp embedded in the recorder's circuitry showed an internal clock that had somehow remained synchronized to the current date. Even more unnerving, the background frequency modulation in the recording matched the snowstorm patterns from 1986, as if the machine had captured a fragment of time rather than sound. Hart spent weeks studying Graves's notebook, trying to understand what he had discovered before his death. His final entries described a phenomenon he called the feedback window, a theoretical alignment between analog lines and atmospheric conditions that allowed residual audio energy to loop indefinitely, replaying moments imprinted into electrical systems. In his handwriting, a chilling line. "Every signal leaves a shadow. Some shadows learn to speak. Investigators reviewing the vault tapes found dozens of similar anomalies. Snatches of voices from long-dead callers repeating the same phrases, bursts of laughter with no source, and one 5-second clip in which an operator's voice, male, quiet, whispered, "Still connected, always." The same words engraved on Robert Lauren's pendant. But the most disturbing discovery came when technicians isolated the final 20 seconds of the 2020 reel and ran it through digital enhancement. Beneath the static and wind, they identified not 2 voices but 3. A faint third voice, breathy and childlike, whispering in perfect unison with Lily's. "He's here." Hart listened to that clip over and over until she began to hear her own heartbeat sync with the static. The analysts dismissed it as cross-feed interference, but Hart had read Graves's last letter. She knew he'd spent his final months convinced the network had become self-perpetuating, that all those voices, captured and replayed for decades, had begun to overlap, forming a kind of consciousness born of repetition and grief. The bunker was dismantled piece by piece, its contents cataloged and sealed under federal order. The official explanation cited unauthorized telecommunications storage, with no mention of the recordings. Still, rumors spread quickly through the Bureau. Agents whispered that the machines had continued spinning for hours after the power was cut, that one technician had fainted when the static began forming her. Hart never confirmed those stories. She resigned 3 months later, citing exhaustion. In interviews, she avoided specifics, saying only that some cases don't end. They just stopped talking. 2 years later, in 2022, a podcast host named Eleanor Pike, the same journalist who had once collaborated with Graves, uploaded a final bonus episode to her dormant feed, Echoes on the Line. The episode contained no narration, no music, just 40 seconds of wind, a faint hum and a voice that said, "Can you hear me?" Then a man's voice replied, "I can. It's okay. I'll take you home." The clip was identical to the 2020 reel, except for one detail. When spectrogram analysts online visualized the sound frequencies, they discovered a hidden waveform embedded in the static, a pattern that, when converted to text, read E. Hart. No one has heard from Agent Evelyn Hart since that episode was uploaded. Her apartment in Burlington was found empty, her phone on the table, still plugged into its charger. The call history showed one outgoing connection made at 9:47 p.m. to a disconnected service number belonging to the Vermont Communications Cooperative. The call lasted exactly 40 seconds. Today, the Echo Pilot vault remains sealed in a federal facility outside Quantico. The tapes are stored in lead-lined cabinets, their reels locked to prevent movement. Yet every February 14th, security sensors inside the chamber register brief surges of electromagnetic activity, exactly 40 seconds long. Technicians describe the phenomenon as harmless background noise, but one night guard filed a report that was never released to the public. His written statement, dated 2:15 a.m., reads in part, "I was doing rounds when I heard a payphone ring. It was coming from inside the containment room. I swear I heard a woman's voice say, 'Jenna?' before it stopped. I didn't open the door. I just stood there until it was quiet again. It's the same time every year. Outside Hartville, the snow still falls heavy in February, muffling the world until only wind and memory remain. The old intersection of Main and Depot is just a scar of cracked asphalt. But locals say that sometimes, if you stand there long enough, your phone will lose service and a faint hum will rise beneath the storm. If you stay perfectly still, you might hear it. A woman's voice, distant but clear. 'Can you hear me?' And somewhere in the static, an answer that always comes, patient and gentle as death itself. 'It's okay. I'll take you home.'"